de soleil, pas 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 de soleil.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March 2023 Council Agenda Briefing. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and their elders past and present. I would like to advise everyone that the audio of this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. I request everyone to please turn off your mobile phones. I remind you that audio recording of the meeting proceedings and photography within the chamber is prohibited unless prior approval has been granted. And councillors and city officers are reminded to disclose any declarations of financial interests and interests affecting impartiality, and are requested to activate their microphones when addressing the meeting. So, with that, we move to item 1, which is the declaration of opening. I'd like to welcome everyone and declare the meeting open at 1 minute past 6 p.m. I do have an announcement to make before we kick things off. This meeting is unfortunately the last meeting that Director Vicky Lummer will be joining us. Vicky, Ms Lummer I should say, has served the city faithfully and diligently for over 13 years now. And during that time, she has overseen a lot of change in the city of South Perth. Her advice has helped to shape the neighbourhood that we live in into the beautiful city that we enjoy today. Would everyone please join me in showing our appreciation for Ms Lummer's service to this city?
Thank you. Thank you very much for those kind words.
It's an absolute pleasure and you will be sorely missed. Best of luck to all future endeavours. So, items for council, agenda items 2, 3, 6, 7, 8.1, 8.2, 9, 11, 13 and 14 will be dealt with at the ordinary council meeting to be held on 28 March 2023. Item 4 is attendances. Item 4.1 is apologies, of which there are nil this evening. Item 4.2 is approved leaves of absence. And Councillor Glenn Cridland has an approved leave of absence for the period of 14 March 2023 to 31 March 2023 inclusive. And Councillor Blake D'Souza has an approved leave of absence for the period of 20 March 2023 to 25 March 2023 inclusive. That brings us to item 5, which is the declarations of interest. And I'm going to ask people to bear with me for a little while because there's a few of them here. So that's Mayor Greg Milner, I've declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as local planning policy scheme 7 affects the zoning or potential use of properties where persons or entities that are closely associated or otherwise associated with me either own the property or have an estate or interest in the property. Those persons and entities include not-for-profit entities that I've previously served on the boards of, not-for-profit entities and incorporated associations that I'm the patron of, not-for-profit entities that my wife has previously served on the committee of, and persons who made election donations to my campaign in 2019. Councillor Glenn Cridland has declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as changes to land use rules, density codings, development rights and requirements, etc. from TPS 6 to LPS 7 may give rise to a financial gain, loss, benefit or detriment to me or a person that I'm closely associated with. Changes to land use rules, density codings, development rights and requirements, etc. from TPS 6 to LPS 7 will almost certainly affect land adjoining my land. Changes to land use rules, density codings, development rights and requirements, etc. from TPS 6 to LPS 7 will affect my land and land owned by many persons known to me. So that was from Councillor Glenn Cridland. Councillor Nick Warland has declared a financial, direct and indirect proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as broad consideration of the city's planning rules is likely to have a future financial impact on Como Ward election donors. Broad consideration of the city's planning rules has the potential to have financial impact on the property owner of the house I currently reside at. Broad consideration of the city's planning rules is likely to impact the property I reside at and adjoining properties. Previous employment with the Property Council of Australia until March 2022 included work for property developers, town planners and other associated entities or professions, many of whom operate or have interest in property within the city. That was from Councillor Nick Warland. Councillor Stephen Russell has declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as LPS 7 includes my primary residence and properties of neighbours, friends, colleagues and acquaintances. Councillor Jennifer Navard has declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as this decision will impact my property at 195 Mill Point Road, South Perth. The decision will also impact land holding and rental charges and income for the following categories of residents and tenants: my neighbours, friends, colleagues and acquaintances, Moresby Ward constituents as their elected representative in the City of South Perth. Councillor Ken Manolis has declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as a new local planning scheme for the City of South Perth impacts upon the value and development potential of properties in the City of South Perth, including my interest in Unit 2, 31 Coode Street, 193 Mill Point Road, 28 Victoria Street, and our neighbours' homes, as well as the homes of family, friends and acquaintances. Councillor Mary Choi has declared a financial proximity and impartiality interest in item 10.3.1 as I, my immediate and extended family and close friends own multiple properties throughout the City of South Perth to which the draft Local Planning Scheme 7 applies. And Councillor Brenda Abrandis has declared a financial interest in item 10.3.1 as I own property and an interest in property in the city for which LPS 7 may impact the commercial property values. So, does anyone else have any other interest that they wish to declare this evening? That's a no, so we're moving on to item 8. Item 8 is presentations, item 8.3 is deputations, and this evening we have 7 speakers who will have up to 10 minutes to address council. I will request that everyone be professional and courteous in their comments, and with that I'd like to invite Simon Stewart Dawkins of South Perth, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Mr. Stewart Dawkins.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. As you know, my name's Simon Stewart Dawkins. I live in Waverley Street in South Perth, and this evening I have a petition to present to Council from 31 Waverley Street residents. There are some other people who have advised me that they'd like to sign the petition, but within the last 5 days I haven't had the time to see them all, so I'll try and get those to Council before next week's meeting. Back on the 28th of July 2020 at the Ordinary Council meeting, there was a report that was presented to the councillors that talked about Waverley Street and that it had been assessed as exhibiting a good level of single residential character. Last year, the City advertised the Council adopted draft planning scheme number 7 from August to November. The information presented at the community consultation briefing illustrated an R15 single residential zoning for all of Waverley Street, including number 1 Waverley Street, and 83 to 85 Angelo Street was listed as being mixed use. This information is still shown on the City's intramaps. The March agenda item 10.3.1b, schedule of submissions number 441, page 84, submitted on behalf of a single person, a developer, who owns number 1 Waverley Street, 83 Angelo and 85 Angelo Street, requests an increase in the zoning. I've been advised that the developer's request for a higher mixed-use density would achieve a significant higher property value for their 3 lots that they own. Unfortunately, however, this would be to the detriment of the adjacent R15 properties, and the 4-storey and 3-storey development sites would impact the amenity and character of Waverley Street. As far as I'm aware, no other Waverley Street residents submitted feedback to council during the consultation, as everybody in the street was of the understanding it was an R15 zoning. And 83 and 85 Angelo Street was shown as mixed use and of an appropriate building height. Due to the South Perth receiving one submission, number 441, the March 23 TPS number 7 illustrates that the zoning for number 1 Waverley Street has increased from R15 single residential to R50 mixed use. The R50 mixed use development, if the R50 mixed use development is approved for 1 Waverley Street, my understanding is that a 3-storey mixed-use development would most likely block 25% of the solstice winter sunlight from accessing the adjacent lot, which in this case, number 3 Waverley Street, number 3 Waverley Street is an architect-designed home with all windows and outdoor spaces facing north, which means a 3-storey development would adversely impact both the indoor and outdoor living spaces, which my partner and I have enjoyed for over 22 years. I'm also aware that between number 1 Waverley Street and number 83 and 85 Angelo Street, a deep sewer is located which requires an easement. Should a mixed-use zoning be approved for number 1 Waverley Street, it will impact the footings, build form, and may require the future building to be pushed closer as possible to number 3 Waverley Street property boundary, which again would adversely impact the number 3 Waverley Street property. Number 1 Waverley Street lot has always been R15 single residential and a buffer between the commercial activity and associated noise from the Angelo shopping precinct. The March 23 Ordinary Council meeting agenda states that dwelling yield has been undertaken on draft LPS 7 to ensure the city will meet its minimum dwelling targets. The petition requests only a minor alteration and that council reinstate the R15 single residential zoning for number 1 Waverley Street, South Perth, to ensure the amenity and character of Waverley Street are maintained. The petition is also requesting that R80 4-storey mixed-use zoning for number 83 and 85 Angelo Street be reduced to R50 3-storey mixed use, and that all future service vehicles and residential vehicles access to be via the rear laneway to ensure the Waverley Street amenity and character are maintained. Providing a R50 mixed use zoning for number 83 and 85 Angelo Street would provide superior built form transition for Waverley Street and will complement the proposed R50 3-storey residential zoning between 87 and 93 Angelo Street, South Perth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Stuart Dawkins this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation.
What do I do with the petition?
If governance, are we able to take that now? Yes, it's...
Thank you.
All right. I would now like to invite Mr Eric Joseph Eisenman of South Perth, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Mr Eisenman.
Thank you. Sensing a common theme here this evening, so that's interesting, and I'm glad to see that you all declared interest, although we used to in the old days get clearance from the CEO, get clearance from the minister, so you could all discuss it without any having to declare something, but I'm glad...
We might move on to the deputation, please, Mr Eisenman.
I'm glad, well, it actually is with the deputation, I'm glad you all realise that the zoning changes do have a significant impact to the properties. That's what I'm here for. I'm here on behalf of 45 plus concerned residents about the increase in the zoning to a now R25 from the existing R15 in the Elizabeth and Hampton Street areas proposed under this late change sought by the WAPC in LPS 7. We submit that the current previously well-researched, analysed and community consulted R15 zoning in TPS 6 and then recommended by the City of South Perth finally concluded in the detailed review throughout 2019 to August 2021 be simply retained as is. This is in line with what was consulted upon and was originally advertised with WAPC's consent, I might add, for Elizabeth Street, which is still, fortunately, and I have to say, without the help or best efforts or interference of City of South Perth and WAPC, managed to retain to date its significant residential character. From the outset, I must admit, we in the streets around have lost a lot of confidence in the City of South Perth planning staff. The staff, the responsibility...
Mr Eisenman, sorry to interrupt, but by all means make your point, but no editorialising on the City of South Perth staff, please.
Yeah, that's a fact that the people are saying, but okay, if you don't want to hear that. It would appear that despite consultation, strong and detailed feedback, submissions received with photos of all the housing stock, etc., all included in the first round of submissions, and then the LPS 7 amendments made to reflect that, the City actually then agreed with the residents off the R15, but now at this late stage, the City of South Perth have again ignored us all, what we said, and what they have changed in our advertised response, and simply accepted and kowtowed to the WAPC changes. The question is why? And then why bother to consult us at all if you clearly do not want to appear to listen? It's perhaps pertinent that I go through a time frame of the process so it refreshes everybody. In TPS 6, initially, external consultants were engaged, a bit like putting a fox in charge of this chicken coop, whose focus was on split zonings, which don't really work and was sensibly at the time rejected by council. A ratepayers group was then formed for the whole area. A number of petitions were lodged and the overwhelming majority was for R15. At the decision time at TPS 6, some of the older, wiser councillors who really knew the area, I can recall them now, just rocked back in their chairs and said, Elizabeth Precinct is one of our best areas, that always needs to be R15. Then in LPS 7 in early 2019, the local residents became aware of an uninformed and non-research initial gambit proposal by our planning staff, which was to change the area to up to
Mr Eisenman, again, I've got to interrupt.
That was
terms like unresearched, not professional. Please keep it to the facts, Mr Eisenman. Last warning.
Okay, it actually is facts because I'll come back to the response that I got from the planning staff afterwards. Based on this significant angst, sleepless nights, etc., were incurred by the locals in the area at R50 for an R15 area, it's going to create some issues. And a petition was handed to council on 29th of May at public question time. That petition, as I said earlier, was from 45 houses, easily could have been 90 residents because we just got it from the house. One person in the house didn't bother getting both. And we also just focused on the top end of the street, so one block and the two streets basically. And at the time, I submitted a visual representation of the petition and the compelling evidence of the overwhelming desire and percentage of our street and the street behind, which is Hampton Street, that would experience overlooking due to the sloping topography for the retention of the current R15 low density coding. We even put a map there with green dots to represent all the people in the street who wanted to keep that R15. There were also attached a number of photos evidencing the excellent existing luxury and character housing stock. And then, in answer to the earlier question, was when I asked at council meeting on the 29th of May 2019, so I can support what I say, I asked, my question was the basic housing planning research done. The comment from the staff involved at the time was that investigation for places 3, 4 and 5, area 5 of the managed growth strategy, including Elizabeth Street, have not yet been undertaken at this level of detail in determining the most appropriate way to implement the action of the draft strategy, including zonings for Elizabeth Street, and assessment of the character in each street within Area 5 will be undertaken in similar detail to the above mentioned area. So the R50 was proposed, yet the housing stock hadn't even been looked at. That was still to come. The submission we lodged dealt with issues including history, lack of analysis, process, consultation, consistency and logic for the proposed changes. The housing stock, which had great existing character, our amenity, including the possibility of overshadowing, the good street trees we have there, the large quantum of density already existing throughout the City of South Perth, in particular South Perth, the suburb, the insidious illogical creeping off this zoning, the lack of infrastructure and services, traffic issue and crime. I don't really propose to go too much over those now, except for to focus on lack of infrastructure. As I stated in my submission originally, and as I knew from when I was on council and TPS 6, the Water Corp infrastructure, that's your sewer, is inadequate to support higher density. It was interesting, if you now read your report tonight, submission 342, that's 342, it's from the Water Corp, and they specifically state that the main sewer is at capacity, needs 3 kilometres of replacement, and that may happen sometimes by 2040. In March 20, the City of South Perth's response proposal was tabled, which now the City of Planners had recognised the residents' concern, having now also, I won't say that, now they'd done their housing analysis, and they were now proposing more realistic changes about the R50. They said as a starting assessment point of up to R25. Then COVID hit, so that was deferred. We had a meeting in July 2020. It was on the agenda, the draft, and was approved for initial referral to WAPC. Some 6 months later, in February 21, WAPC reviewed all the submissions and the changes and accepted it and went out for advertising. That then was deferred by council for workshopping in July 2021. Then it was again deferred, and then in August 21, City of South Perth finally resolved to advertise the amended scheme, but it was very clear, and in recognition of our feedback, the review of the housing stock, and I quote from your own reports, the existing R15 was to remain in the blocks east of Addison Street for Milsons, Elizabeth and Hampton Street. This was now the City of South Perth staff and council approved advertised resolution after more than 2 years of review and consultation. Specifically, the attachments noted that the area was to be retained to preserve its existing built form. I don't think I have to remind you that nothing's changed since August 21, except if you walk the streets, you'll see that the housing stock has only improved. So I guess that's why we're a bit confused. So the question is, why after all that full, extensive, clear reviews and changes and consultation, have the council now slipped in this increase to put it to R25, just really because WAPC have asked for it? The change, as far as I can see, has not been drawn out or explained to the residents in any of the most recent correspondence. And I asked, was it ever specifically spelled out that Elizabeth Street has changed and so on and so forth in reports to the councillors? I've never seen a letter, report or map to residents or council stating those specific changes. This report here tonight goes to great lengths to try and justify and explain how good the consultation was. In my view, it simply wasn't. It was instructions for those who came to presentations, but there wasn't really that full detailed disclosure. When I saw the R25, I exploded at home. I said, what's going on here? And my wife said, oh, wasn't that what was agreed? And to me, it just demonstrates that most had lost track of what was going on. It took 3 years and we didn't know what council was doing. It was R15, then it was R50, then it was R15 or R25, then it was R15, and then now it's gone to R25. No one knew. So in summary, I would just ask—
30 seconds remaining, Mr. Eisenman.
Can I ask for a minor extension, please?
No, I've got to be fair to everyone.
Okay, I just ask that you look and deal with what we've got. There's 4 points that I want to make out. Is in Como, McDonald and Gardner Street, those people have got R15 and they want R25. Now, I would respectfully say, and they'd probably agree with us, that Elizabeth Street is a more highly valued area, so it doesn't make any sense. I would suggest too that we tell the WA Planning that we don't consider any—
That is time, Mr. Eisenman. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do have to be fair to everyone.
Well, I probably wouldn't have—
Councillor,
I would have run
Mr.
short
Eisenman,
if you hadn't interrupted me.
Mr. Eisenman, that is time, please.
All right.
Councillors, does anyone have any questions for Mr. Eisenman today? Councillor Brenda Abrandis, did you have a question for Mr. Eisenman?
Yes, thank you very much for your deputation, Mr. Eisenman. Just in summary, in closing, can you just give us your summary points as to what you would actually like amended with regard to LPSL?
Councillor Brenda Abrandis, you can't ask a question that effectively extends the time. You can't do that, I'm sorry. Councillors, does anyone have any question about what Mr. Eisenman has said this evening without extending the time? I'm sorry, the standing orders provide for 10 minutes per person for deputations. I I can't extend it. And if I did that, I would have to do it for everyone. So I'm sorry, I do appreciate what you're saying, but rules are rules, and I do have to be consistent. So-
15, that's what we want.
I'm going to move on to the next person to make a deputation. So it's Ms. Loanne Castle of Kensington. And I understand that Ms. Castle is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi there. This is my first time in there, so I hope you'd be nice to me. My name is Luanne Castle, and I'm just here this evening as a private citizen. I reside in the city of South Perth the past 18 years, and I am a registered nurse and a mother. So my teenagers sent me in here today, essentially, because they love trees. So I haven't actually got a home to go to if I don't actually get this across. So I'd like to say a few things supporting the current actually, do you know what, it'll help if I put my glasses on? Right, sorry, I'll start again. I'd like to say a few things supporting the current LPS 7 for scrutiny tonight, and I'd like to be in support of further amendments to strengthen the protection of trees on both public and private land. I acknowledge the diligent work done to get a broad perspective on the community consultation process, and I know that the overwhelming support has been for tree protection with this consultation process. Okay, very specifically, I'd like to ask some questions that you don't necessarily have to answer, but I just want the council to be thinking about them because this is the conversations that we do have at home, and I do a lot of work with a lot of teenagers as well. So to hopefully generate some discussion on why this is important for the council to understand the average citizen's perspective, and I am very average. So like many of my kids' generation, they are very educated on the challenges of climate change. They have loved and enjoyed the many amazing spaces across the city of South Perth, and I would acknowledge the continued value and protection of these areas. However, we are very distressed by some recent events that have implied a different direction of the council. It's already been very enlightening for me to listen in to this. So this has led to having many family discussions on the LPS 7 consultation and to family discussions on the process and specifically on tree protection currently before the council. Here are the very specifics that my 14 and 16-year-old would like to know. Why are we building so many ugly concrete buildings and removing lots of interesting houses and the old trees to build these concrete buildings? So we talk a lot about urban infill and the need for people to have somewhere to live. So that, you know, we do understand that there are other things that we're not aware of. We understand that bushland is cleared to make housing developments, which is also not great. However, we have also seen for ourselves how hot some of these treeless suburbs, outer suburbs are, and we think how awful it must be not to have green spaces and trees around where people, particularly kids, live. I reckon they probably also have big energy bills. Our second point is we would like to know why land, these are examples that my kids have come out with, which is the corner of Leigh Street and Manning, near where my daughter works at Ruby Girl, was cleared of all the old trees before it was even sold. You can tell the questions that my teenagers come out with. Why is there no protection and even approval required to move these trees? Don't people know that McDougall Park is awesome? Obviously, direct quote, and people want more of that stuff, not less. What are they even building there? Why are they allowed to do that? How sad that no one spoke up. And it is not cool that there's nothing wrong with them doing that because there was no rules to say that they couldn't do anything about that. Number 3. We would also like to know why public land on the Kensington Police Station, and I do grant that this is technically in the City of Victoria Park, but it's still public land that is a good example, that they cut down 9 of their trees down just to help them with the pavers and the leaves. So their comments were, don't they know that police need all chill time and that they can get with their hard job, as indeed all of us. Again, lots of people put lots of work into the Gerrardup Reserve. Didn't they read the room? Why were the admin staff lazy? Sorry, that was a direct quote, and just don't want to clean up the leaves and fix the pavers, which they had to do anyway. We would also like to know what would happen to all the trees and green landscaping done at our primary school and many other families if there are no protections. What will happen at school at Como Secondary School if all the pine trees are taken down? What will the cockatoos eat and where will they nest? Why would people chop down trees to have more car parking spaces? Don't they know how to use a bus or ride their bike? Why do people chop down their trees so the swimming pools they never use don't fill up with leaves? Why do people chop down trees to put a driveway in that just, could go on the other side, and so on? The thing I love most about these conversations with my teens is that they keep me accountable by asking these questions. And so I come to you to ask these questions to keep you also accountable. We also talk about some possible solutions like incentivising keeping trees by lowering rates or maybe decreasing building approval time. This could also work really well with good legislation. So, in closing, what are the council going to do about providing tree protection in South Perth? What kind of leadership will the council be providing to support the LP7 to achieving some sort of tangible and accountable goal? I don't personally think it's unreasonable to ask for an approval process for trees over 8 metres on private or public land prior to removal. It affects all of us both mentally and physically, whether we acknowledge it or not. If there is a good reason for it, like it's dangerous or if it has shot borer, which that actually is an impending disaster, then it needs to come out. We have no issue with that. Trees also need deep roots, so any building plans need to address that. Other states seem to have the balance a lot better. I don't understand why we can't, especially as we already started a lower point having sandy soil and lower rainfall. The problem will always be that some adults cannot be trusted to make good decisions for the benefit of the community, especially when there are large amounts of money involved. This is why we need to have strong legislation, policies and real consequences in place. Incentives are good too. This is also why there are so many volunteer groups, as it is clear that the City of South Perth is currently not funding these areas adequately at present. I think generally people are starting to think differently and have come to expect more from their elected members in leadership roles. We've come to expect more transparency and a little more intelligent thinking around these type of issues. As a community, we've started thinking about nature and trees and how it is in our own interests, perhaps survival, to preserve and protect our urban landscape and wider, and perhaps a bit belatedly in some cases. We certainly expect a lot more from our elected representatives, and I don't make an apology for that. What are you going to do to support this, and how are you going to answer the question from your children and your grandchildren on what you did in your time of leadership? I would like the City of South Perth to be innovators and thinkers and not destroyers. Thank you for your time and commitment to your community. Thank God I finished.
Thank you very much for your deputation.
Thanks.
Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Castle this evening? You might be off the hook. I think you are. Thank you for your deputation. All right, I'd now like to welcome Bronwyn David of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Ms David.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, council staff. Bucking the trend of the initial speakers and actually coming out in favour of something like the previous speaker. I'm speaking in favour of the proposed provisions in LPS 7 to protect trees of 8 metres or more on private property in South Perth. And thank you to the councillors and the administration staff who had the foresight to propose this amendment. I note that protection of mature trees in the area meets the aims of the scheme, supporting sustainable urban neighbourhoods, supporting an urban environment that encourages healthy, active and sustainable living. I note also that in feedback received by the council, the majority of the comments in respect of the provisions protecting trees were positive and supported the retention of mature trees. And I think it would be a very brave councillor who discounted the level of feeling about the protection of trees in the area. The concerns in respect of the provisions can be summarised as a concern for private property rights and limitations to redevelopment opportunities. Those words are taken from the councillors' papers. The limitations and redevelopment opportunities really just being a subset of the concern for private property rights. Addressing the issue of private property rights owners' rights to do as they please on land within the City of South Perth is already circumscribed. There are rules as to where on their land they can build, the purposes for which they can build, the heights to which they can build. The purpose of these rules about what people can do on their own private property is to preserve the amenity of the community. We already recognise that what people do on their private property impacts on those around them. So in this sense, extending development applications to cover the removal of large trees is not a big step, but simply recognition that trees offer an enormous benefit within a community, and they are obviously things such as heat mitigation, encouraging, walking and outdoor activity, and hence enhancing the community, wildlife habitat, and even the attractiveness of the area. And the least of which advantage is enhancing the value of properties and hence the value of the area in general. Other mechanisms to preserve trees on private property, such as the Significant Tree Register, have not had any impact on the preservation of canopy in the city, as illustrated by the fact that we have a Significant Tree Register and yet canopy coverage on private property continues to fall. Further, the Significant Tree Register spreads the burden of tree preservation unevenly amongst the community. It is those who are most conscious of the need to preserve trees for health and wildlife and heat mitigation, and hence list their tree on the Significant Tree Register, who will wear a financial burden, because I think we can reason that, in terms of development, it is a lot easier and cheaper for developers to build on a clear-felled site. So if they're faced with the sale of a block that has a significant tree registered on it, or the sale of a block that doesn't, they would always prefer to buy a block without a significant tree registered on it. Leading on from that, the supposed limitation on development opportunities, which was expressed as an argument against the tree protection measures, if the preservation of mature trees is required consistently across the city, developers will find that they will simply have to adapt to building around mature trees, which developers in the majority of Australian states seem capable of doing. After all, development continues apace in cities with much stronger tree protection provisions than we are currently discussing, without the breakdown of private property rights or civil society in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms David this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Mr Neil Kingsbury of South Perth, who is speaking against the officer's recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Mr Kingsbury. And the microphone is yours.
Thank you. I don't really have much to say, just I support my neighbour Eric's position about changing the rezoning of Elizabeth Street. I think it's a concern. A few years ago we signed a petition where a lot of the residents objected to the changing of the density, and we didn't expect that it would this issue would be revisited again. I support all of the comments that he said. Elizabeth Street is quite a unique street, and would like to maintain the amenity of the street. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Just hold the forces for a moment. Does anyone have any questions for Mr Kingsbury this evening, councillors? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. I'd now like to invite Mr Andrew Cunningham of Northbridge, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Mr Cumming. Welcome. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, councillors and staff. My name is Andrew Cumming and I'm a Principal Town Planner at Rowe Group. This presentation is made on behalf of Penrose College and will focus only on building height requirements outlined under draft local planning scheme number 7 for the college grounds. We have no objections to anything else included within the draft scheme. We've engaged with the City of South Perth's planning team late last year and in early 2023 to review and make comment on the draft local planning scheme number 7. We thank staff for their time and efforts in considering our submission and for taking on board the majority of our recommendations. By way of background, we note the following. Penrose College is bound by 3 streets: South Perth Lawn Tennis Club, Collier Retirement Village and a Western Power substation. It forms part of a large expanse of land for the aforementioned tennis club and retirement village, as well as surrounding reserves at Rari Reserve, Bill Graydon Reserve, Collins Oval, Collier Reserve and Collier Park Golf Club. In this regard, residential development is removed from the subject site's immediate boundaries. Penrose College has been subject to specific building height and setback provisions since 2009, and this guides building height within an angled plane from street boundaries up to a maximum building height of 10.5 metres or 2 to 3 stories approximately. The draft local planning scheme subject to public consultation was generally consistent with the existing provisions, with the exception that the maximum building height is 15 metres or approximately 4 stories. In making a submission on behalf of Penrose College, we recommended that the maximum wall height within 20 metres of the street frontage is 2 stories, up to 8 metres, measured from natural ground level, and the maximum building height beyond 20 metres is up to 6 stories or 24 metres, as measured from natural ground level. The first point has been supported by staff, and we thank them sincerely for this consideration. However, the second point relating to maximum height has not been adopted, and only a 1 metre increase up to 16 metres or 4 stories has been supported. Reasons for not adopting our full recommendation has not been outlined in the schedule of submissions. We wish to make clear that the height provisions adopted by staff only reflects the existing scale of development at the college and will only enable minor increases in the order of greater floor-to-floor height and will not enable growth over time without removing valuable open space area. For example, the recent science block buildings includes 4 levels. This last point is important, as local planning scheme provisions last for many years, and the current provisions have been in existence since 2009. This is testament to how important the decisions we make now are, as they have lasting implications that could still be felt 20 years later. We therefore believe that further consideration of the proposed maximum height for the college should be undertaken, particularly paying regard to the contained site we are speaking to. It is also worth pointing out that the original provisions paid particular attention to overshadowing of the adjoining retirement village buildings located 15 metres to the south of the college grounds. Given the retirement village includes an R-code density, overshadowing impacts would need to be a key consideration for any future development application at the scale requested over the college. Finally, we understand that there may be a concern that this requested change may require the local planning scheme to be re-advertised due to the idea this represents a significant change from that advertised. To this, we submit the following. The City wants its ratepayers to have a say on the local planning scheme, and to limit the potential for change could be viewed as contrary to the intent of the exercise. We have taken up the opportunity and have made cogent and valid reasons for the building height requested, and believe that it will enable considered and appropriate growth opportunities for the college for the next 15 years or so. This is important as there's only so much space on the college grounds, and the logical solution is to go up, to provide greater amenity for staff, students and parents around future buildings. Therefore, we do not believe that concerns over the need to re-advertise should be the primary consideration when making these decisions. We would therefore ask staff if there are any fundamental concerns with the height limit identified or as recommended. If there are no such concerns, we submit that decision-making should not be guided by concerns over the need to re-advertise and should be made solely on planning grounds, given the lasting consequences that follow. We thank you and your staff for their time today and over the last few months, and kindly request that the modification to enable development at the college up to 6 stories be made to the draft local planning scheme number 7 before it is adopted by Council and submitted to the West Australian Planning Commission for final assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your deputation, Mr Cumming. Councillors, does anyone have any questions for Mr Cumming this evening? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Cummings, for your deputation. So I understand Penrose College sits on quite a prominent hill position, and it actually is quite a bearing building at the moment. So going to 6 stories, what is your opinion then that it would have a further bearing on the locality?
Through the chair, in terms of views, impacts to residential land?
In terms of its bulk and height, because it's predominantly sort of like 2-storey R20 buildings around.
So through the chair, it has been a key consideration, and I think, to be fair to the current local planning scheme and the amendment made back in 2009, it was always a consideration. Even up to 10.5 metres, that angled plane was talking to, I suppose, bulk and scale. Arguably, though, with the requested modifications, really the full scale up to 6 stories would likely be located centrally within the site, or perhaps towards the southern boundary. So while it would be at the, I suppose, the top of the site, so to speak, or it does start to head down in a southerly direction, that in terms of those wider impacts to, say, the residential lower density areas, yes, you'd be able to see the building if it was developed, but it would be, I suppose, your view pan of it would be amongst a much wider site, and therefore what amounts to an extra 2 stories beyond what existing development there is, we would argue that that's entirely appropriate for a site of this scale.
Thank you, Mr Cumming. Councillors, any further questions for Mr Cumming this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation.
Thank you, and thank you again to Vicky for a long-standing service. I really appreciate it.
I'd now like to invite Ms Kathy Lees of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Ms Lees.
Good evening, Mayor, councillors and city staff. I've got a PowerPoint which I'm assuming is visible in front of you all, which I'll be talking to. So I'm here as a landowner and a resident, and on behalf of the South Perth Tree Canopy Advocates and the WA Tree Canopy Advocates. I would like to speak in support of the tree regulation provisions proposed in draft Local Planning Scheme number 7. I commend the city's administration for listening to the community and putting these provisions back into the scheme after they were removed by the WAPC. There is a rapidly growing groundswell of community members in South Perth and across the Perth metropolitan area who are very concerned about our dwindling urban tree canopy and want our decision makers to take action to stop the loss of mature trees and grow an effective urban forest for future generations. And as you can see from the screen, there was a large number of submissions in support of tree protection provisions for the scheme. We also have growing numbers of community groups across the city. We've got 16 local TCA groups now, and we've got a WA TCA group. We've got over 11,000 people who are very concerned about our dwindling canopy, and those numbers are just increasing at a rapid rate. On to the next slide. So why trees? Trees provide a very long list of environmental, social and economic benefits that are well known and beyond doubt. This list is actually out of the city's own urban forest strategy. It's not exhaustive by any means, but it just shows you some of the key benefits that we see, that we gain from trees. Urban trees are not just nice to have. It's been recognised around the world for some time that trees need to be considered as essential infrastructure if cities are to be livable into the future. Unfortunately, WA has just been a bit slow to catch on. There is a lot of science behind this. This is not just a group of tree huggers talking about trees. This is highly respected and qualified experts and organisations across the world calling on all cities to take action to protect and plant trees, including organisations such as United Nations and the World Economic Forum. There are endless studies and reports detailing the science, some of which I've listed here for anyone that's dubious to refer to afterwards. So how are we going in the city of South Perth without tree protection provisions? For what was always known as a leafy green suburb, we're not doing well. It's widely accepted around the world that 30% is the benchmark for an effective urban forest. And in 2020, we were sitting on 17% in South Perth. And in terms of suburbs, Salter Point and Manning were sitting at only 14%, as you can see from the table. This is Department of Planning data, so it's reliable data. And it's highly likely that given the development that has occurred since 2020, that has left little or no room for trees, that these percentages have now declined further. What is particularly sad to note for me is that on private land, which makes up 57% of the land in the city, we only have 6% canopy cover arising from trees over 8 metres in height. Most of our large trees on private land are already gone. Arguably the most damaging impact of low tree canopy is the urban heat island effect. With trees and other vegetation being replaced by concrete and hard surfaces, we are seeing the impacts of urban heat island effect in our city, and it's only going to get hotter. This mapping was done in December 2020 on days when the maximums were in the low 30s, and it shows temperatures ranging from between 31 degrees and a whopping 57 degrees in the red spots. So the 31 degrees is the dark blue. Importantly, what this mapping also shows is that while it's important to plant trees in our parks and streets, this does not provide equitable or effective cooling across our suburbs and around our houses. That's the bottom half of the city. If we are to reduce the impacts of urban heat island and provide the many benefits of trees that evenly across our suburbs so that all residents benefit, then we need to include private land in the equation. We need to protect the remaining large trees on private land and ensure we leave room for lots more to be planted. Bronwyn David also has already spoken about the significant tree register and why they don't work. I've just got a slide here showing the significant tree registers across the Perth metro area. It clearly illustrates that they are not an effective solution to tree loss. Aside from the administrative equity issues, they just don't work because the landowners who are most likely to cut down large trees are also the landowners who are the least likely to request or agree to their inclusion on a significant tree register, which is why we only have 12 trees on private land on the tree register at the moment. So again, Bronwyn David spoke about the private property versus community rights. But there are clearly many precedents for imposing restrictions on private land to protect the amenity of neighbours and the community. And I would argue that none are more critical to the community amenity than the protection of trees. This should be a priority in terms of community amenity. Every other state has tree protection provisions and has had them for many years, and life has continued. They won't prohibit, the provisions won't prohibit tree removal, they won't stop development and infill, and they don't mean development has to cost more. They will require all other options to be exhausted before trees that have taken decades to grow are chopped down. And they will require architects and designers to spend a little more time and be a little more creative when designing new development. My last point is in relation to the specifics of the proposed provisions. While I'm wholly supportive of the intent of the provisions, I believe that the criteria for the large trees needs to be expanded. The draft provisions only specify height as the criteria to trigger if removal of a tree requires development approval. But standard practice is height or canopy diameter or trunk diameter. I'm not sure if you can see from these photos that I've taken in South Perth Street, examples of trees that have large canopies and large trunks and provide all the benefits of large trees, but are unlikely to be 8 metres in height. These are some examples of provisions with the 3 criteria. The one at the top is City of Sydney DCP, which is actually referenced in the officer's report. The one in the middle is the City of Nedlands draft scheme amendment.
60 seconds remaining, Ms Lees.
Yep, just about there. Which the WAPC chairman at the recent Walga Urban Forest Conference indicated that he believed the amendment was well worded and a good template. And the last one is out of the WAPC's own document for medium density codes, which recently came out. So it would seem wise to amend the provisions in the draft scheme to align with standard practice and ensure that all large trees are regulated through the provisions. In conclusion, thank you for listening to me. I hope you will all support the community by supporting the tree provisions and allowing them to progress in the scheme to the WAPC and the Planning Minister for determination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Lees, for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Lees this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. All right, we now move on to item 10, which is the draft March reports. And I now hand you over to the Chief Executive Officer, Mr Mike Bradford, to take you through the balance of the draft March reports.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.1, Collier Park Village. Collier Park Village has been owned and operated by the city since 1986. Over the past 30 years, community expectations and the standards for retirement living have changed, and the needs of older people in retirement have become more complex. The city is committed to improving and enhancing the services and amenities available to the residents at Collier Park Village and want to support village residents to stay in their residence and age in place. However, the city lacks the expertise and financial capacity to make significant improvements to the village and provide the right mix of accommodation and services to deliver contemporary standards of retirement living. Due to the age of the asset and the current operating model, Collier Park Village has been operating at a significant financial loss over recent years. Such losses are not sustainable in the long term. This report outlines the options available to Council regarding Collier Park Village.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? I might have a couple. I think they might be to Mr Adams, but if they're to Ms Lummer, I'm happy with that as well. First question is, there are 194 residents living at the village. Some of those residents are on lease for life contracts, while other residents are on short-term leases of 12 months duration. Could you please walk us through the protections that each category of resident will have during the request for proposal process? Mr Adams, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Residents have been made aware of the protections that exist in the retirement village legislation, as well as the additional protections that the city has put in place as minimum requirements for the request for proposal process. Anyone on a lease for life arrangement has an absolute contractual right to stay in their unit for the entirety of their lease, regardless of who owns or operates the village. People on short-term rental arrangements currently have a lease period of 12 months. The city has set a minimum requirement that any short-term leaseholder will be offered at least 12 months lease from the date of any contract being signed with a new operator. It is, however, expected that any potential operator will be an experienced not-for-profit organisation that's mission and values-based. And whilst we've not set a specific percentage of units that will be available for rent on an ongoing operating model, how incoming operators will manage existing residents and specifically rentals will need to form part of their overall submission. This is where they will specify any additional protections offered and will be reflected in the evaluation of the proposals put forward, if any are, to council for decision. It's also worth noting that we'll be proposing that there'll be no increase in fees or rents for existing residents in this year's budget.
Thank you very much. And my second question is, could the city walk council through the engagement that the city has undertaken with the village residents in this matter?
So on Thursday, the 16th of March, the city's CEO, 2 directors and city staff met with around 100 residents at Collier Park Village to explain the request for proposal process and outline the reasons why the city was recommending this course of action to council. Residents were provided with a copy of the council report and further information regarding their rights and the process. Subsequent to this meeting, the city CEO provided each resident with a letter regarding the process and contact numbers if further information was required. On Monday the 20th of March, the city CEO, directors and staff again met with residents at Collier Park Village to respond to questions received subsequent to the first meeting and answer any further questions from the floor. This meeting was open to all residents and their family members, and approximately 80 people were in attendance. If council makes the decision to progress with the request for proposal process, we'll continue to meet with residents to keep them updated as to where we're at in the process. And we've also made available information and frequently asked questions on the website, and hard copies are also available at the village. We've made it known that if anyone has any questions, they can ask the village staff or they can contact myself as the contact person for the City of South Perth.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions I had. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just following on from your questions, I'm just wondering if the city is able to provide any feedback received to date from any residents or their families during the recent consultation period, please.
Mr Adams?
Yes, so specifically there was a number of questions raised around the protections for people who are on short-term rentals and what would potentially happen at the end of their leases. We're actually specifying, at the moment they currently have 12-month leases. We're specifying in the selection criteria for proposals that they have a 12-month period beyond, at least a 12-month period as a minimum beyond the contract date for any new operator. But we're expecting that the operators will want to keep rental people in the village because it creates some cash flow. We're not expecting that any development would happen straight away. We also had some questions around, so our expectation is that the majority of people that want to stay will be able to stay beyond the 12 months anyway. All of that will be, this is only a decision to go, and one of the questions was around, how this process works. This is a process of requesting proposals from the market. We don't have to accept them, and nor would we accept proposals that don't meet our requirements that we get somebody that can run the village better than us. And that's the overriding concern, is that we get somebody that can do it better than us, that can provide a better village for current and future residents. There was questions around the land tenure. Currently it is a management order to the favour of the city for the purpose of aged persons accommodation. we are looking at, it's obviously state government land. The type of land tenure we're looking at is conditional freehold, and the condition would be that it is only used for aged persons accommodation, similar to what it is now. So those protections are also in place for residents going forward. So a lot of, I guess, the questions came around, we have, I think it's 69 rental people in there at the moment, and most of the concerns were around, the future for those people. And so I think that will be a big consideration for council when it comes to evaluating the proposals going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Could the city walk us through how an approved landscape plan agreed within the contract, it makes its way onto the planning scheme?
Ms Lummer, should I send that your way or to Mr Gibbons? Ms Lummer.
Yes, thank you for the question. As we've had discussion leading up to today about what is the best method of ensuring that, say, for example, the trees are protected, and we've talked about that in the vision statement. However, if and when we get a proposal, or if we have a proposal, at that point there will be further detail that's required from the proponent, and we can look at possible draft or possible future landscaping. So at that point, it would form part of the negotiations, and likely the best place for anything like that would be in the final contract, because that would provide more certainty than anything that can be in the scheme, because a future council may change the scheme, or in fact there can be obviously discretion applied through the scheme provisions.
Thank you, Ms Lummer. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Mr Redford, next item, please.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.2, proposed lease agreement for the Collins Street Centre Playgroup Incorporated, located at the Collins Street Centre, Collins Street, South Perth. This report seeks approval for the City of South Perth to enter into a new lease agreement with the Collins Street Playgroup for its continued use of part of the Collins Street Centre, located on Lot 11 and Lot 13 on the corner of Collins Street and Shaftesbury Street, South Perth, for a 5-year term, with an option of renewal for a further 5-year term.
Thank you. Councillors, any questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Joy.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just wanting to ascertain, generally with these type of leases for not-for-profits and playgroups and toy libraries and things like that, what happens if for some reason during the tenure they suffer some hardship or they aren't able to meet up with their lease obligations? Is there some sort of ability for them to reverse back to like a hire purchase or license agreement? Or just wondering if that's ever happened before or what the provisions are.
Should I send that to Mr Quigley?
Thank you for the question. The lease provides more clarity around the terms and conditions for the parties involved, but the lease also makes provision for annual evaluation of the relationship. So the city basically follows up the requirements. We meet with the groups to ensure that they're meeting their obligations, and that's done through our community development department. But the benefit, I suppose, to both parties is that the tenant can get certainty over their tenure, because they've got a commitment from the city that there's a long-term agreement in place, whereas at the moment there's only an annual agreement. And so the benefit to them is that they can also apply for funding, knowing that they've got up to 10 years of tenure at that location. So that's generally seen favourable from funding bodies' perspectives.
Thank you, Mr Quigley. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just with regard to the term of 5 years, this is quite different from the other community groups that we actually offer terms for. So could you just explain why it's a 5-year term in this instance, please?
Mr Quigley.
The 5 years is the initial period plus a 5-year renewal, if I'm correct. And that's consistent with the policy provisions.
Thank you, Mr Quigley. Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Right, thank you, Mr Quigley, and thank you, Mr Mayor. Just with regard to the conversion of this to a lease, just wondering why this one's actually remained quite different from the other leases that we actually have in place for the other community groups.
Mr Bradford.
Can you tell us what differences you're actually referring to?
So this is a conversion from a hire arrangement as opposed to a lease arrangement. So are the conditions the same? This particular, the same?
So if you're saying this is different to others, can you, I mean, because I don't think this is different, it's consistent with the policy.
I know if it's the same.
And the only reason it's coming to council is because we're proposing a peppercorn rent, which is the one thing that is different from the policy.
Right, then if it's the same, thank you.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
So thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.1, Draft Local Planning Scheme Number 7, Consideration of Submissions and Recommendation. Draft Local Planning Scheme Number 7, LPS 7, was adopted by Council on the 24th of August 2021 and then modified by the West Australian Planning Commission on the 31st of May 2022 prior to public consultation that occurred from the 31st of August 2022 to the 29th of November 2022. The Planning and Development Local Planning Schemes Regulations 2015, the regulations, require Council to consider all submissions and pass a resolution to either support Draft LPS 7, not support Draft LPS 7, or support Draft LPS 7 with modifications to address issues raised in submissions. The time frame for this recommendation is 120 days after the submission period, which is the 29th of March 2023. The City received 470 submissions during the engagement period, including 331 feedback forms, 325 of those were online, 6 were hard copy, and 139 written responses. 137 of those were emails and 2 were hard copy. 3 petitions were also received by the City. The report recommends that Council supports Draft LPS 7 with modifications to address issues raised in the submissions.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration this evening on this item? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I've got a number of questions. The first 2 are administrative in nature. So the first question is, in the track change document within the attachment, I was expecting to see some red line markups or something similar like a revision bar where the changes are, but I can't see anything as like that. Am I missing something? Because it's just not easy to identify within the text where the actual amendments are.
Ms Lamar, should I send that to your way or to Ms Burbick? Ms Burbick.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it should be attachment C is the modified with the track changes. We also have an attachment which doesn't have the track changes. It's with the modified text.
Thank you, Ms Burbick. You had another question there, Councillor Russell?
Well, actually, it's a clarification because I am looking at attachment C and the header for that is attachment C, and I can't see any kind of revision bars or red line markups.
Ms Burbick?
So there's not very many modifications to the scheme text itself. Have you looked at where one of the modifications is proposed? If you, let me just go into my version.
I can't see.
So if you go to page 43, for example, there should be changes to ASR 3 for Jubilee Street.
Page 43?
It's 43 in the attachment.
Sorry, I can't see anything. So this is regarding Penrose College?
Perhaps we can take this one offline and maybe take that one on notice. All right, thank you. You have a further question, Councillor Russell?
Yes, so under the standing orders for petitions, I understood that the City needed to report on the specific matters of the petition. So We have 3 petitions at hand, excluding the one that's just been submitted. So one petition is in regard to trees, and I can see that the city has addressed that matter. However, I cannot see how the other 2 petitions are specifically addressed within the officer's report.
Is that Ms Burbeck or Ms Lummer? Ms Burbeck.
So the matters that were raised in the petitions have been addressed in the report on their various matters. So matters relating to density, to traffic. We haven't included a specific section in the report to respond to the other 2 submissions in relation to density. They're just addressed by the nature of the comments in the report on the various issues that they raised.
So in terms of governance, is that actually in line with the Standing Order 6.9?
I might send that one to either Mr Adams or Ms Tucker.
Thank you. In relation to this matter, the report in relation to the draft planning scheme is on the council's obviously agenda for this evening and next week for council's consideration. So if you were to accept a petition, it can only be accepted at council, which means that the planning scheme would not be able to consider the submissions through a petition, which would not be appropriate. So that has been addressed in this report. And of course, you heard this evening that another petition was tabled this evening. So it's appropriate for those submissions that came in through a through a petition to be included in the report if it's been received prior to this report being tabled.
Okay, thank you. Just some other questions, if I may. So with regards to Preston Street Activity Centre sites, the department is requiring these to be defined as RAC3, which, as I understand, has a height limit of 6 storeys and a plot ratio of 2. So why is the city therefore recommending RAC0 to all Preston Street activity sites to council rather than the department's RAC3?
Ms Burbeck?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So when the amendment went through to TPS 6, those sites were coded RACO, and that's what was approved in TPS 6. That's what they are currently. When council considered the scheme in August, it was the officer's recommendation that they go to RAC3. Since we've advertised the scheme, the owners of those properties have made a submission and said, the RACO aligns with the building height that's identified in the scheme and was approved in TPS 6. So that's what's been recommended for those properties.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, further to my previous question then is, as we have RAC0 and ASR13 has been assigned to the Amendment 63 Preston Street sites, and as ASR13 does not speak of plot ratio, then how for these sites is plot ratio controlled under the scheme?
Ms Burbeck.
Thanks for the question. So it'll operate in the same way as it does under TPS 6. So this is the intent for LPS 7, is that it's carried over in its entirety from Amendment 63. There isn't any plot ratio requirements currently under TPS 6, and so hence why we've carried it over in LPS 7, in the same way.
Okay, thank you. So another question is it theoretically possible that if the current arrangement of RAC0 or O is applied to all Preston Street Centre sites, that is the additional sites further towards Melville Parade, then is it correct that increased development potential exists when compared to RAC3? For example, could ASR 13 or similar be applied to these sites other than the amendment sites, which allows for buildings to exceed 6 stories, possibly up to 13 stories?
Ms Burbeck.
So like I said before, it's intended that the building height provisions which operate in TPS 6 now apply in LPS 7. So in the schedule for ASR 13, that has the building height requirements which apply to those sites for the Signet Theatre site and the surrounds. The intent was always that that those properties will be able to redevelop in accordance with those heights. The RAC3 density wouldn't prohibit that. I guess officers were incorrect in assigning that density code in LPS 7, and we're rectifying it by putting in the RACO density. So that's clear that these building heights that are in the schedule and apply to the site do apply.
Actually, my question was referring to the sites, the Preston Street sites, which are exclusive of where ASR 13 currently exists. So the property sites closer to Melville Parade with RAC 0, is it possible then that these could be further developed in line with the existing ASR 13 sites? And therefore we could see additional buildings which exceed the 6 stories.
So the RACO only applies to those properties where the ASR requirements apply. The rest of the properties which are RAC3 are outside of that area, so they would just be developed in accordance with the R code, so they would be subject to that 6-story building height.
Okay, I apologise, I must have looked at the maps incorrectly then. Okay, thank you. Have further questions if I can, or if another councillor wishes to?
Might as well carry on, Councillor Russell.
Okay, thank you. So under the state government's Perth and Peel at 3.5 million strategy, the city is to meet an additional dwelling target of 8,300. So with this in mind and based upon the 8,300 additional dwellings, what is the total dwelling target? And for the version of the LPS 7 before council now, what is the variation to the total dwelling number? For example, the additional number yields X more dwellings than the total target imposed by the state government. Very happy to take that on notice.
Is that Ms Burbick or Ms Lummer?
Yeah, we'll take that one on notice.
All right.
Okay, additional question. So for the property zone R100 with a SEA 1 condition west of Canning Highway between Felmer and South Terrace, excluding the corner properties, if these properties were zone R80, could the city provide an estimate in the reduced number of dwellings? Again, very happy to take that on notice.
Ms Burbick?
We'll take it on notice. If we can just clarify which properties, if it's all of those properties in that catchment that you're referring to.
Certainly, I mean, I can send an email if that's more clear.
That'd be great.
And regarding a deputation today regarding 1 Waverley, where there's a sewer easement on 1 Waverley, I wasn't aware of that. So does this sewer easement, which I guess bounds or is close to the boundary with number 8385 Angelo Street, does this prevent any building built on number 1 Waverley being part of a potential building on number 8385 Angelo Street?
Ms Burbick?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it'll be something that the proponent would have to work with the Water Corp and work out if there's any alternative design solutions which could be possible.
Okay, thank you. And I guess this will be my final question. So Main Roads recommends a transport study be performed to determine the impact on the road and movement network from development along Canning Highway. Has the city provided the ITP and in particular the associated traffic consultants analysis to Main Roads to understand if this satisfies their recommendation? And further on, is the city's traffic engineer confident that the ITP satisfies Main Roads' recommendations?
Ms Burbick?
So as you mentioned, Flight was commissioned by the city as part of the Integrated Transport Plan, and the Integrated Transport Plan was referred to Main Road for comment, including those attachments, so they would be aware of the transport studies that the city has undertaken. We haven't since engaged the consultant to act on behalf of the city in relation to Main Road's comments. We feel that those are addressed in the schedule of submissions by the city. I guess the outcomes of those traffic reports was that the city could achieve its strategic land use goals without failure of the network, and that's what we're relying on as part of the scheme.
Okay, thank you. And I did like one more question. Is there any reason why the tree DA provisions does not include a canopy size or a trump size?
Ms Burbick?
So we've undertaken quite extensive research on this issue, as you'll see in the report. The City of Sydney, which was the example mentioned by Ms Lees, has those requirements, and those have been in place for some 40 years. They are accepted and very well understood by the community. It's our intention that we provide clear and simple approach to the tree preservation requirements on private property as our first version of these requirements for the city. This is why we've limited it to just tree height. If they're successful, that's not to prevent the city from reviewing those provisions in time to see if any additional criteria is appropriate.
Thank you, Ms Burbick. Councillors, any further questions for the administration on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a few questions as well, which I have provided on notice. So the first one is, can the City Administration please confirm if it considers or accepts or responds to submissions or feedback received from ratepayers after the closure of its public engagement periods, even when there has been further modifications made to the draft LPS 7 following closure of the most recent public engagement period, please?
Should I send that to Mr Gibbons? Yes.
Just for a change of voice through the chair, thank you very much for the question, Councillor Choi. I'll start off with some gobbledygook. Under Division 2 Regulations 25/2 of the Planning and Development Local Planning Schemes Regulations 2015, the local government may consider submissions on a draft scheme lodged after the end of the submission period, but before the end of the consultation period. The purpose of this provision is intended to provide discretion to consider submissions which are made within a reasonable time following closure of the advertising period, or otherwise as previously arranged with the city, i.e. in the case of government agencies where they are under time pressures and they advise us in writing within the statutory time period that they will be running a little bit late. As a matter of process, the city cannot consider submissions after the report has already been prepared and the agenda has been released for the council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you through the chair for that response, Mr Giddens. So in respect to the list of further modifications for inclusion in the updated draft LPS 7 as supported by the city since evaluation of public submissions and feedback received during the public engagement period, have those landowners who lodged a submission or provided feedback during the public engagement period been notified of the city's recommended outcome?
Mr Gibbons.
Yes, thank you through the chair. Yes, all submitters have been notified by email of the Council's consideration of draft LPS 7 and submissions at the March round of Council meetings.
Thank you, through the chair, Mr Giddens. My next question is relating to that. Previous question is, similarly, have those landowners next door to or within the vicinity of those properties with those proposed modifications supported by the city been notified of those draft modifications since release of the draft LPS 7 during the public consultation period? If not, how does the city expect those nearby affected landowners to learn about the further modifications, especially if they have reviewed the draft LPS 7 previously and didn't have any concerns to raise during the public engagement period, but now may have since there have been further modifications?
Mr Gibbons.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair. The city only notifies submitters of the council meeting. The city cannot interpret which landowners generally or may not be affected by modification. Alternatively, the city would need to notify by mail all residents and landowners in the city to advise them of council's consideration of the scheme prior to the council meeting, which is considered both unreasonable and costly.
Thank you through the chair again, Mr Giddens. My next question is in relation to the newly supported rezoning and recoding modification for number 1 Waverley Street, South Perth to R50 mixed use from R15 single residential. If not but for that landowner owning 2 separate commercial properties next door, fronting Angelo Street, South Perth, and requesting the modification in line with those commercial property interests, the city would not be supporting that modification now in the updated draft LPS 7. Is that correct, please?
Mr Gibbons.
In advertising a scheme, the community and landowners are allowed to make a submission. In this instance, the landowner of number 1 Waverley did make a submission and provided an argument in relation to providing a more comprehensive development package, and that is what was considered appropriate in this instance.
Thank you through the chair again, Mr Giddens. What, if any, implications are there for foreshadowing an amendment to the draft LPS 7 for number 1 Waverley Street, South Perth to retain an R15 coding in keeping with the remainder of the single residential street and as advertised during the most recent public consultation period?
Mr Giddens.
Thank you. Through the chair. The only implications of the above would be that number 1 Waverley Street would be limited to a single house, and it would not be able to form part of any comprehensive redevelopment with the landowners adjoining properties at number 83 and 85 Angelo Street.
Thank you, through the Chair, Mr Giddens. I understand the Angelo Street Managed Growth Area and Neighbourhood Centre is set to see an increase in density under LPS 7 from lots typically coded R50 3-storey to lots coded R80 or above, which I think equates to 4 to 7 stories. Is that correct in that first instance? My estimate, 4 stories, okay. If so, can the city please outline how it plans to manage the impact of a foreseeable increase in traffic and parking issues, which issues are already being faced by residents on Waverley Street and neighbouring streets, due to not just the activity from the commercial precinct, but also from the local schools, including senior students who drive to school and have nowhere but the residential streets to park their vehicles?
Mr Giddens.
Thank you, through the Chair. The Council endorsed the local planning strategy in July 2020, which sets out where increased density will be accommodated within the city. This included Angelo Street Neighbourhood Centre. The densities within the draft LPS 7 align with those identified in the strategy endorsed by Council. As per the Council report, the City will consider the increase in traffic generated by population growth as part of its routine review and upgrading of road infrastructure and ongoing traffic management, having regard to the outcomes of LPS 7 and the recommendations of the Integrated Transport Plan. In relation to parking, the City will continue to implement the parking strategy and to monitor street parking patterns, management and apply restrictions as required, i.e. time restricted. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you, Mr Giddens. And just a reminder to all councillors that please do try and keep your questions as concise and succinct as possible. Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and again, Mr Giddens. So in respect to ongoing ratepayers' concerns for the proposed recoding of certain blocks within Managed Growth Area 5, Canning Highway, places 3, 4 and 5, being the street blocks between Hensman Street, Milson Street, Elizabeth Street and Hampden Street, to the east of Addison Street, and acknowledging the positive response to their prior 2019 petition submission presented to Council to retain their R15 coding, I understand many residents were unaware of the subsequent WA Planning Commission modification until after the closure of the latest public engagement period on the further modified draft version of the LPS 7. If the City has confirmed that it cannot engage after the closure of its public engagement period, or when the report is ready to be presented to Council, I'm just wondering what the implications are then for the foreshadowing of an amendment to the further modified draft LPS 7 for these street blocks to retain their R15 coding that Council previously endorsed in the first draft version.
Mr Giddens.
In short, the Council can make whatever recommendation they wish. However, in saying that, I'll just preface it by these words. Those landowners who did not make a submission during the advertising period may make representation to Council when the item is considered, and we've seen that this evening. There are no implications to modify this area back to R15 density, other than it may not be supported by the WAPC, who modified this area to R25 prior to advertising. So we're acting on their instructions. The following motion could achieve the above, i.e. modify street blocks between Hensman Street, Milson Street, Elizabeth Street, Hampden Street to the east of Addison Street from R25 to R15. Thank you.
Councillor Choi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor, and again, Mr Giddens. So I understand as part of their modifications, the WA Planning Commission removed Table 7 pertaining to building height from the draft LPS 7. What are the implications, if any, of an amendment being sought to reinstate that table in the current draft, please?
Mr Giddens.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. If the building height table was reinserted, it would replace the R codes with respect to building height. There are no further implications to that. We note, though, as the table was previously removed by the WAPC, it is unlikely it will be supported if reinserted.
Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple more questions. Again, thank you, Mr Giddens. What is the process for amending the City's local planning strategy if for whatever reason it is appearing to be out of touch or sync with ratepayers' expectations and infrastructure requirements, particularly in single residential areas and in neighbouring residential streets to commercial precincts, as has been outlined by my questions?
Mr Giddens.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Part 3 of Regulation 17 of the regulations, thank you for that, provides for amendments to a local planning strategy. The WAPC, however, will not support any amendments to our local planning strategy at this point in the planning process with the progression of draft LPS 7. Regardless of any proposed modifications to the strategy, if Council decided to go down that way and utilise those regulations, the scheme will continue along its current statutory process to be considered by the WAPC and Minister.
Thank you, Mr Giddens. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And my last question, again, thanks, Mr Giddens. So in June 2022, I brought and then deferred a motion to Council on the protection and maintenance of trees during development, which really focused on incentivisation, encouragement and education around tree retention as opposed to mandated regulations on property owners. On reviewing the new draft tree retention and local planning policy enclosed on page 252 of the agenda attachments, being the main reason behind my motion being withdrawn, I cannot readily identify any real incentivisations as I hoped, only mandates. And I'm just wondering if a relevant officer could comment on that, please.
Mr Giddens? Oh, Ms Birbeck.
Yeah, through the chair. So the medium density codes, which have just been released by the state government, include incentives for retention of trees, which provides for subdivision dispensation and landscaping. So there's also that in volume 2 of the R codes. So that coupled with the scheme provisions is believed to offer, incentives for people to retain trees.
Thank you, Ms Birbeck. Councillors, any further questions on this item for the administration this evening? I think Councillor Navard was first.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is quite a simple question in comparison with my colleagues. I'm just referring to the tree preservation policy, attachment 1, page 258, the undesirable tree list. And I noticed that swamp she oaks and river she oaks were both listed as undesirable. Now, I was puzzled by that simply because I know that a lot of those trees may not look too pretty, but in fact they serve a very significant environmental impact by dealing with salinity. So I just was wondering about what the process was for deeming them undesirable. That's all. Thank you.
Ms Lummer, should I send that to you or to Ms Birbeck? Or Mr Giddens?
I would think I think we'll take that one on notice. There will be a sound reason for that, Councillor Navard, and we will check with our colleagues. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions, Councillor Navard? No. Councillor Russell, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. In the officer's report, the city states, I quote, the city's public open space, sorry, let me repeat that. The city's public open space strategy will be reviewed in the context of the increased population growth occurring through LPS 7. I'm a bit unclear to what exactly that means. Is that mean we're going to procure additional public open space? I mean, what's the intent of that statement? Thank you.
Who should I direct that one to? Ms Birbeck?
Through the chair. So the city's current public open space strategy is quite outdated. It's currently 2012, relies on old population data from the 2006 census. The idea would be to look at, additional cash in lieu of public open space, how that can be obtained through subdivision. The Department of Planning are currently reviewing the public open space policy framework, and there's potential to investigate, for instance, obtaining cash in lieu funds for multiple dwellings. Essentially, it's just indicating that there's an opportunity to look into how that strategy operates and how we can obtain, how it should operate in the planning framework in a current context.
Thank you, Ms Birbeck. Further question, Councillor Russell? No. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. With regard to the tree policy, I've noted that there's obviously trees that are actually desirable, but in the actual listing there aren't any significant trees which actually provide habitat and food source for black cockatoos. So just wondering what sort of consideration we'd be giving to appropriate trees, and also large trees. So I'm talking things like the jarrah tree, the marri tree, blackbutt, banksia, trees that actually provide a food source. Knowing very well we've got one of the largest roosting sites south of the river for the black cockatoo population.
Who should I direct that one to? Mr. Gibbons?
I'll start the answer, and if we don't get to where we need to, I'll pass it on. Now, the trees which you're referring to, Councillor Brandis, and thank you through the chair, are trees which would be above 8 metres in height, so therefore they would be captured under that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do note that some of the trees actually in the list do grow above 8 metres as well, but these important native trees are actually not in the same list. So, for example, avocado trees above 8 metres. So I was just wondering if we could make sure that we do include the important native trees as part of that listing.
Mr. Gibbons?
Always happy to take those type of suggestions on board from our community and our elected members. So if you've got any specific tree types or species that you want us to include, please just advise us and we'll see what we can do to add them in. Thank you.
Any further questions, Councillor? Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a question with regard to Elizabeth Street and Hampden Street. So obviously the increase in density across the city is a drive to achieve our targets for the urban infill and increased density. Concerns, I suppose, with regard to that precinct, they do actually have a lot of heritage homes there, and of course the increasing R zoning will obviously result in further development in that area. So what sort of consideration has the city given to that as a heritage precinct, and also the number of residents that have actually signed a petition to actually retain an R15 zoning?
Who should I send that one to? Mr. Gibbons?
Thank you for the question. So the first part of the question was with regards to heritage. We are preparing our new heritage policy as part of our suite that will come back to this council for adoption in due course, and we're in the process of procuring some consultant specialist advice to assist us with that. And that will also cover off on areas around the policy and also look at some character areas as well. It's something that this council has not ventured into previously, and so before we move down those pathways, we have to be very cautious and very careful as to how we consider that as well. So we're currently going through that process at the moment. We'll start with a policy before we move into any of the other requirements around heritage and conservation areas specifically, because that can cause quite a lot of concern and upset for our community members and their housing. With regards to the petition for that land around Elizabeth Street area, that petition was received back in 2019, and the number of submissions that we got in relation to that area were quite low, and we can only go on the submissions that we have. We ask through the consultative process, which is fairly extensive for this scheme process, for some comments. We understand that people are busy and things do fall through the cracks. So hence this is where this forum is a good forum to raise some of those issues, and it allows the councillors to make those decisions about any notice of motions or modifying the scheme following the advertising process. Thank you.
Councillors, Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you very much for that response, and through the chair. It was just with regard to Waverley Street. It was noted that obviously there's an easement and sewer access. The current proposed zoning, does that have any impact on access to the sewer access?
Should I send that to Mr. Gibbons?
Not that we're aware of.
Any further questions on this item, councillors? I might ask one. We have had a deputation referring to the consultation process, and it has been mentioned in a couple of the answers to related questions this evening. I do understand that the city undertook a program of community engagement and consultation with respect to the draft Local Planning Scheme 7. I suppose, could the city walk the council through the consultation process that the city ultimately followed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, it's a valid question, and consultation for these type of projects, and indeed any of the strategic planning projects we undertake is very important, and to do that in a sincere and concise manner is also very important. The consultation for draft LPS 7 was carried out over 3 months, equaling 90 days, as in accordance with legislative requirements. We received 470 submissions on the scheme, which reflects a pretty good awareness of the community. And you've seen how those submissions in one of the deputations gave a very good breakdown of those that were around specific issue and those that were around more general issues as well. It included over 28,000 letters sent out directly to all residents and property owners in the city. Letters to community groups, we had direct emails to our strategic planning database, i.e. those people who have previously engaged with us on previous planning projects, and that number's over 1,000 people. We had articles in the Peninsula, we had e-news blasts going out, we had a dedicated LPS 7 webpage on the Your Say South Perth site. We undertook 5 community information sessions held across the city on both weeknights and also Saturday mornings. So there was a lot of personal time and out of hours time in order to meet with our community and ask them questions. We did have over 160 people turn up to those as well. So, and it was good to meet the community as well. We did newspaper advertisements, we had banner signage across the city, we had a number of social media posts, we had displays at the Civic Centre and also at our libraries, and more, including all of the telephone calls and the request systems that were running within our. We had a bespoke mapping system that we also put onto the website, where people could actually go in and then look at their properties and see what the before situation was and what the after situation was, simply by clicking a button. So there was quite a lot of work that was done over that 3 months, from August to November. We lived and we breathed the scheme. And I think the 470 submissions was a good attestation to the work that we did on that as well. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Giddens. Councillors, any other questions on this item? No. If we could move on to the next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.4.1, listing of payments, February 2023. This report presents to Council a list of accounts paid under delegated authority between 1 and 28 February 2023.
Councillors, any questions for the administration on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements for February 2023. The monthly financial statements are provided within attachments A through I, with a high level of analysis contained in the comments in the report.
Thank you. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.4.3, Electors General Meeting 21-22. This report allows Council to consider the outcomes of the Electors General Meeting held on the 7th of February 2023.
Councillors, any questions for the administration? No. Next item, please, Mr. Bradford.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.5.1, Audit Register Progress Report, Quarter 2. This report provides an update on the progress of actions included in the Audit Register. The Audit Register includes all open audit findings that have previously been accepted by the Audit Risk and Governance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? No. Oh, no. Councillor Choi on the buzzer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question in relation to the strategic internal audit. Just wondering, how does council or elected members go about bringing a new potential risk to that strategic? I mean, that's the council's audit plan, isn't it?
Mr. Adams, should I send that one your way?
Wondering how do councillors or elected members go about doing that?
So are we talking about adding something to the strategic risk register or adding something to, so not the audit? So the strategic audit plan is based on the strategic audit, the strategic risk register. When we review the strategic risk register, which I think we do every 6 months, then that's the chance to add strategic risks or discuss some of the strategic risks and how they're rated. So that would normally be done at the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions for the administration? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.2, Risk Management and Business Continuity Activity Report. This report outlines activities undertaken by the City of South Perth risk management function for the period December 22 to March 23 to provide an overview of the activities planned for the fourth quarter of the 22-23 financial year.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.3, Compliance Audit Return. This report provides the City's response to the Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries 2022 Compliance Audit Return.
Any questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.4, Annual Review of Council Delegations. The City has a statutory obligation under the Local Government Act 1995 to review its delegations each financial year. The terms of reference of the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee include responsibility for reviewing the City's delegations. A review of the Council delegations has been completed and has been presented to the Audit, Risk and Governance Committee for consideration and referral to Council for adoption.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration? Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So under the Town Planning Scheme 6 delegations, is it theoretically possible that a DA for a heritage listed site and not subject to DAP or the Special Matters DAP not come before council for determination?
Who should I send that to, Ms Lummer or Mr Gibbons?
Mayor, could we take that one on notice, please?
Of course.
Thank you.
Any further questions, councillors? No. All right. Next item, please, Mr Bradford. Oh, no, I think that is it. My apologies. So that brings us to item 12, which is motions of which previous notice has been given. That's nil. We do have an item 15.1.1, and if anyone's got any questions on this item, we will need to close the meeting at this juncture. So does anyone have any questions on item 15.1.1, which is a confidential item? That's a no. Okay. In that case, we'll move on to item 16, which is closure. So before I close the meeting, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation this evening. I declare the meeting closed at 7:52 p.m. Thank you all and good night.